So welcome to this Travel Weekly webinar on the latest UK consumer holiday intentions. I'm Ian Taylor of Travel Weekly, and I'm joined today by Charlie Gordon, Insight Director at Kantar. Charlie has more than 20 years experience in the research industry. He's going to speak for 15 to 20 minutes about the latest consumer holiday intentions, and then we'll have a brief Q&A. So Charlie, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, I'm from Kantar, and really what we've been doing is just looking at some of our survey data to understand what 2022 might look like from the point of view of the British public and how they feel about taking holidays this year. Obviously, it's been a challenging couple of years on that front for everyone. So quickly, just want to talk about the data that I'm going to be using in this presentation. Kantar have one of their flagship products really called TGI, which is a huge survey, been running for, I think, probably about 50 years now, which is built on a representative sample of about 24,000 people every year in Great Britain. And what TGI is basically a large single survey exploring all aspects of adults' day-to-day life. So from their demographics through product and brand usage, attitudes towards life, purchasing, brands, etc., leisure activities, media consumption. And that data is used throughout, particularly the media industry, by media agencies, by brands, media owners, to understand what their audiences are doing in the world, and really kind of understand, where advertising fits within that and where people's minds are. So that's just a bit on what TGI is, but I'm going to kind of launch right in really by first of all just taking a quick look back. I know we're probably all quite tired of looking back at the last 2 years. It feels like we do a lot of it, but perhaps not surprisingly, and I'm sure you're all well aware, before the pandemic, obviously life was rosy. We were all doing what we did. And you can see here in our data for the year from April 2019 through to March 2020, we had this kind of amazing spell where, 45% of us, for example, were taking a break in the British Isles through that year, 40% of us going on a short break or holiday abroad. But then as we go from basically when the pandemic started, so March, April 2020 through March 21, we see that number drop off sharply. So from almost half to under a third. Similarly, holidays abroad from 2/5 down to fewer than a quarter. And then in this most recent year, from 2021 April through to sort of bang up to the minute in March 2022, again, just over a quarter, and holidays abroad less than 10% in the last 10, 12 months, as a result of things like restrictions, lockdowns, etc. So it's been a really challenging time. And obviously that's reflected in how people have felt about the last couple of years. But what's kind of really encouraging, and what we're trying to do here, is look forward rather than dwell too much on that. What's been good to see is that actually how people feel about holidays and how much headspace they occupy really hasn't changed. Here in 2019, 2020, I enjoy planning holidays. Over half of people, obviously there's a stress that comes with planning holidays, so some people probably enjoy it less. But I'm always looking for inspiration on where to go for holidays and short breaks. So that kind of, keeping in touch with things like, kind of the industry journalism, trends, etc. As I say, 2-3 years ago, people very much kind of around half of people really playing an active role in that. That hasn't changed really over the last couple of years. We see from 2020, when the pandemic began, enjoy planning remains really strong. Looking for inspiration, again, remaining really strong. And in this most recent year, where we've already seen that people actually going on holiday had reduced dramatically, but actually continuing to really feel strongly about going, wanting to plan holidays, looking for inspiration for trips. So that kind of engagement with travel has just remained really strong, despite the fact it's been harder to do. So what does it look like as we head into the year ahead? Well, the good news is that really that kind of interest is starting to translate into people actually taking action. Over a third have either booked a main holiday, and this is main holiday we're talking about here, not just short breaks. So an actual big, the kind of annual family holiday or whatever. We've got 16% saying they've already booked those trips, 20% saying they're planning to, a big chunk of people, admittedly 2/3, saying they're uncertain, but that's not necessarily surprising given that what we tend to see in the data is that people will generally book between 1 and 3 months in advance. So actually at this point, we're still well in range for the sort of big summer season effectively. We're only in April. July is still 3 months off, for example. So who's driving that booking? Well, of those who've already booked, perhaps not surprisingly, it's the people who've got, good income, no commitments, perhaps. So over half of those people are 55 plus, they haven't got children in household. Really, they're able to kind of act much more quickly. And often, people will say they've had a good pandemic. If you've come out with your health, you've probably been getting a good salary, you've not had to go to work as much. All of these things have kind of put time and economics in their favor. But equally, in terms of people who are planning to book, it sort of the age range come down. About half of them are 25 to 44, more likely to have children in household. So it's those people who are perhaps, a little bit more challenged in terms of their time and their commitments, but equally they're ready to strike. They're looking ahead in 2022 and saying, yeah, we're going to be getting on with booking holidays. Just a quick word on sort of the type of people perhaps who are doing that. The people who are really holding up holiday bookings we're seeing are what we call in our TGI data, we've got a segmentation called life values. Two of the groups within that are experiencers and materialists. Experiencers are really defined by the things they do, the places they go, and they like to tell people about it. So it's those people who are, Instagramming a kind of lovely holiday destination, nice restaurants, etc., really living life to the full. Materialists, a kind of similar group, but where it's very much about, the things they've got, the stuff they have, their ability to kind of, spend their money on nice things effectively. So those groups in that sort of planning to book range are really gearing up to get spending in 2022. And in terms of where we're looking to go, I guess what's been interesting over the last couple of years is this sort of, the move to what people call the staycation. It's whether it's kind of at home or going around the UK. But actually, as we look ahead in 2022, we're seeing that Europe is very much the favoured destination. British Isles holding up strongly, and 20% people saying that features as their main holiday. But Europe, over half looking ahead, and then also a quarter of people saying other places around the world. So we're very much starting to broaden our horizons as travel opens up. But we don't live in a bubble, and travel certainly doesn't occur in a bubble. And I think, we're all well aware that at the moment, economic concerns are very real. And what's striking in the data we've seen in the last month or so is how much that affects most people. Often, with statements like worried about rising price of life, we see fairly, kind of split responses. But here we've got over 3/4 of people saying, I'm worried about the rising price of life. And that's true when we look at different groups based on age, based on where they live, based on whether they've booked a holiday already, whether they're planning to book. All of these factors, we're seeing people are worried about costs going up, whether that be inflation, etc. All of these things that are just getting more expensive. It's definitely very much on people's minds. Similarly, energy bills getting much more expensive. 2/5 of people, quite strong number there. I mean, it almost looks small compared to these other two numbers, but that's a lot of people worried about those bills obviously coming through. And I think because that's only just perhaps starting to land on people's doormats, we maybe haven't even seen that quite peak yet. It's definitely a very strong figure in terms of how much people are concerned about that. And certainly last but not least, the impact of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, what that's going to have on our economy. People very much in mind of that, probably related to things like energy, etc. But more generally, just on the economy, it's very much, again, in people's heads across the board. Really quite striking numbers of people who are thinking about these things. But what's kind of incredible really is that that hasn't dimmed our enthusiasm in terms of people planning to spend on holidays in the next 6 months. We're seeing a really strong kind of, planning to spend on holidays in the UK. This is kind of general holidays rather than main trips, but also planning to spend abroad, nearly half. I think perhaps reflecting, the UK is still perhaps the simple choice. It's, you can rely on being able to get places, easily, etc. On things like, you know, the rules around COVID being the same here as they are that you're used to at home, whereas perhaps still some uncertainty with abroad, but really quite striking numbers of people who are saying, you know, yeah, I'm getting on with spending. And the strength of spend among those who are looking to go in the next 6 months. What's really striking here is that those who are going abroad are talking about significant holidays. We've got this kind of pent up demand effectively, where almost, well, what we've got, a fifth of people, 19%, are saying I'm going to spend a lot of money, which is quite a bold statement. You know, it's almost quite un-British to say I'm going to spend a lot of money. It's quite brash, but people are ready to go, ready to spend. Holds true a little bit for the UK, certainly moderate and a lot, over half of people, but it's this a lot on holidays abroad that we see really strongly coming through this year as a result of, I think, that kind of desperation to get back to the holidays we're used to. And where's that money likely to go? Well, what we've seen, we asked people specifically kind of which elements of their holiday, you know, they're excited about, where they're going to spend that money. And it's really the kind of, I guess, the big elements of it. It's the destination and people saying, I'm going to spend more this time, almost a third of people, whereas very few people saying they'll spend less. The accommodation, so higher quality accommodation, a fifth of people saying, yes, I'm definitely going to spend more this year. Very few people saying less. Length of stay is the other big one, where again, people are going for longer. Perhaps that's partly driven by, you know, it's a bit more complicated to go at the moment, perhaps, but also because it's been so long since a lot of people have done this kind of trip. So let's take advantage. You know, maybe you go for 14 days instead of 10, or 10 instead of 7. That just really jumps out that people are kind of going there. Similarly, eating out, you know, they're ready to kind of enjoy themselves abroad and really have that experience. And what is that experience? Well, really that experience, I guess, is the kind of classic beach and resort holiday is the one that's most popular and the one that people are looking forward to. Of those who've already booked or are planning to book their main holiday, they're talking about a beach and resort holiday. That sort of stacks up in our minds and makes sense just purely because it's perhaps the thing that's most difficult to replicate in the UK. You can obviously have a beach or resort holiday, but the weather's a factor, the type of experience is just perhaps a bit different from what you get, particularly in that kind of classic European beach and resort holiday. But we also see things like lakes, you know, mountains, very popular. Because we're talking about main holidays here, city breaks a bit less popular. I think if we were talking about kind of general travel, we'd see that a bit higher. But as I say, we're kind of focusing here, asking people to focus on their main trip. So it's the beach and resort holiday that people are really excited about. And when are we seeing that happen? Not surprisingly, the summer peak. It's basically ramping up through the year. So May and June really starting to kind of come through, just under a third of people. And then for July, August, September, that's really the kind of big period when people want to get away. That feels like that, you know, kind of summer peak holiday is what people are excited about getting back to. But we talked about a quite significant amount of people who still aren't sure, and that, you know, that's not necessarily they're uncertain, they're not planning on doing it. It's more just perhaps their plans haven't firmed up. But perhaps things that are driving their reluctance to book, certainly a large amount, just under half, saying uncertainty around travel restrictions, and a fifth of them saying uncertainty around personal income. So, you know, as the economy's kind of, you know, entering a difficult phase, perhaps a little bit unsure about where they are in terms of what they should spend or whether they should spend, but also what's going on in the world in terms of restrictions. Obviously, here in the UK, it seems like perhaps we're in a bit more of a stable position in terms of where we are, particularly with COVID and what's likely to happen with restrictions, but it's still not always clear abroad what different countries are doing. So perhaps people are having to think a bit about that, and also, you know, how some of it's being handled in different places. What we don't necessarily see in this data, just because it just kind of was finished before it started kicking in, but is some of the current stuff around, you know, difficulties at airports and so on, which perhaps overplayed in the media, but just not factoring here because it hadn't necessarily started to come through. So we'll be keeping an eye on that in the months ahead and seeing if that maybe starts to impact some of these numbers. I've talked a lot about the UK, but just quickly sort of take a look at our sort of European cousins. We also run a kind of parallel TGI survey across different countries in Europe. We've got here Germany, France, and Spain. And it's no surprise to see that, you know, on things like enjoying planning holidays and passion for travel, they're very similar kind of outlook to the UK. The Spanish say they're a bit more passionate about traveling, but essentially this kind of similar story. You know, everybody looks forward to it. Everybody's excited about holidays. It's a thing that we all kind of hold dear. In 2020, so kind of looking back to 2019, we had this kind of, you know, amount of people who were saying they were taking a holiday or short break. Essentially 7 in 10 across Germany, France and Spain saying, yes, I've got a holiday planned, I've taken a short break, etc. So a really big number. But then much like we saw in the UK as COVID hit, so in our 2020 to 21 data, we see here people who've been able to take a holiday or short break in the last 12 months has just plummeted, under half in Germany, France, just coming under 2/3 in Spain. Which you can almost certainly be sure would have been relatively domestic. So as traveling shrank, what's interesting is that this still, the similar kind of outlook towards travel remained, still looking forward to planning holidays, still passionate about it, but the ability to do it dropped. So we see that kind of, again, just where that pent-up demand is coming from, is how much people love travel. And, you know, they're not losing that habit over the last couple of years. So coming back to GB, I mean, what's great is they're really encouraging signs of resilience. In terms of the overall population, we've got 12% of people saying they plan to spend a lot on holidays. So it's really, you know, a kind of big ticket item that people are saying, yeah, I'm doing it. And what's striking about that is how much we asked this in quite a long list of other things. So things like home renovations, moving home, weddings, you know, etc., but also things like kind of new tech, gadgets for the home, new car. And the one that was a clear top was planning to spend on holidays by a long way. We've got some of the others here. You see 4% with new smartphone, 3% with new car, luxury clothes, really low numbers compared to holidays. So it's really the thing that we're kind of waiting to spend on. And just finally, what's really interesting to see in recent months is how our attitudes are starting to evolve, perhaps as we, you know, get into 22 and we start to get that optimism about what we're going to be able to do and the direction of travel, particularly around COVID. I'm desperate to be able to book a holiday abroad this year. Late last year, that was kind of running around about a quarter, but over the last few months, it's been steadily growing to the point where now we've got over 2/5 of people saying they're really desperate. Whereas I guess the sort of interesting flip side to that, or not quite flip side, but just a sort of, you know, tempering of it is, whatever the situation with coronavirus, I intend to holiday in the UK for some time to come. That's kind of plateaued and is maybe starting to drift down. So again, as people are starting to feel a bit more confident, their eyes are just drifting abroad. They're thinking, actually, it's going to happen this year. We're going to be able to go abroad. So that sort of feeling that we're stuck in the UK, I think, is beginning to drift a bit. So yeah, I think overall, really encouraging signs that travel is set for a kind of good 2022. Really strong attitudes among the public suggesting that it's the thing they're going to prioritise above all others. And that is me done, Ian.
So Charlie, thank you so much for that. It's overwhelmingly positive, despite the whole number of challenges we know about. Over a third of consumers have already booked or are planning a holiday. Just a couple of clarifications on that. How do you define planning? I mean, is that somebody just saying I'm planning a holiday, or is there more to it than that? Because people chat about holidays all the time, don't they? So is there something concrete? How do you define it?
Yeah, as you say, it's something that people are talking about full stop, as we see from some of the other data there. But yeah, it's a pretty simple definition. We just ask people to say, are you planning, and particularly in the data that you've seen in this presentation, are you planning a main holiday this year? And we essentially ask them, are you planning, or have you booked, or are you not sure if you're booking? So yeah, so you pick one of three.
Okay, and do you know how the breaks that have been booked or are being planned break down by domestic and international? Or is that not something you look at in that question?
That I think is in that data we had on yeah, the kind of where people are going.
Yeah,
So we had the British Isles, Europe, rest of the world. So
yeah,
essentially, I mean, Europe and the rest of the world, I think was over 3/4 of people
yeah.
saying their main holiday will be in one of those.
Yeah, of course, you're right. And do we know of the main holidays that have been booked? Do we know what proportion are new bookings, and what proportion are, bookings made during the pandemic that have rolled through into this year?
That's a really good question. We don't, unfortunately. That's not something we asked people to review. Although I wouldn't, I mean, it's pure speculation on my part, but I wouldn't be surprised, given the age skew, if some of those are rollovers. Certainly, anecdotally, we hear about, people who are sort of in that 55 plus group are more likely to have things like cruises, etc., that have been rolled over and rolled over. So there will probably be some overlapping in that.
Okay, the demographics of those who've booked and those who are planning their main holidays were interesting, I thought. So more than half of those who've got a holiday booked are 55 plus, you said, and almost half of those planning their main holiday are age 25 to 44, and a lot of them with children, so they're families. Is that overwhelmingly about finances? I mean, clearly they could have been pre-booked previously, obviously, and those with children need to plan because of school holidays. But it's interesting that younger adults are so underrepresented in those two categories. So would you attribute that to being about finances?
No, I wouldn't actually, because we did look at the way the kind of wages break down within that, or household income, and actually we saw in planning and in booked already, often a skew to groups with quite high income. So not much disparity there. I think it's more about circumstance and the practicalities of doing it. I think if you're potentially retired, empty nester, for example, you can pick a date in the future and kind of not need to worry about it. You're going to be available. If you're in that group with children, etc., you're perhaps waiting a bit more just to see how things are going before you commit to a potentially difficult journey, or having to cancel and rebook or something. So I think, yeah, there's more to it than just pure finance.
Okay, you talked about the cost of living concerns and so on. 3/4 worried about prices. Can you put that in some sort of context? Is that particularly high?
It feels very striking to us. We've tried to look at anything we might have that's comparable, and to be honest, we don't really feel like there's a situation that exists in sort of modern memory that is, because of the Ukraine factor, because of the energy worries, because of inflation, etc. There are all of these things that people, certainly more kind of, recent generations have just never had to deal with. So I think the fact that they're playing on people's minds isn't surprising. What is interesting is that so far they don't seem to be stopping people do stuff. And actually, I saw some data yesterday in the New York Times suggesting they're seeing similar in the US, where all of these things are going on, but actually consumer confidence remains pretty high despite that.
Yes. So the appetite for holidays not yet dimmed, but do you expect that to change then?
It's a dangerous game to make predictions, as I'm sure you know, and we don't necessarily have any data that would support one way or the other. I think in the immediate future, we're probably not expecting it to change. I think pent-up demand is so strong that people are raring to go this year. I think that all of that kind of attitudinal data we have about how much people enjoy their holidays, the things they're looking forward to and spending money on, there's a real sense that people are kind of champing at the bit this year. If we hadn't had the 2 years we just have, we might be seeing perhaps, some of the economic concerns, etc., striking people a bit more. But I think we're probably going to see a fairly robust year in terms of people's resilience so far. I mean, that's kind of as we pitch the deck, we do feel it's about resilience for people on holidays.
Yeah, that fits as well with the 1 in 5 almost saying they're going to spend a lot more on overseas holidays. I mean, that's a very high proportion, it seems to me. Presumably, to an extent, that reflects an appreciation that prices will be higher anyway. But then subsequently, you also pointed out the proportion expecting to stay longer, to spend more on accommodation, I guess, because they're upgrading and so on. Would you see that as particularly high?
I think so, yeah. I mean, as I said, it strikes me as quite a brash statement to say I'm going to spend a lot more. And we're perhaps not known for our brashness, but I think, again, to that kind of idea that people are just really, really excited about the opportunity to go on holiday, and they're really making the most of it. Again, anecdotally, we're hearing stories of, people who have decided, you can't sort of push pause on that trip of a lifetime. Maybe you've got to go now, kind of thing. You've got to take advantage while you can. So yeah, I think that just kind of comes from a number of factors, really, that people are.
Okay. Yeah, there's another element of your presentation highlighted the uncertainty. Almost 2/3 uncertain about taking a holiday. Half, this surprised me a little, half still uncertain about COVID restrictions. Was that a surprise?
It seemed high, I would agree, but I think, given where we've been, perhaps with kind of some of the kind of back and forth on restrictions, particularly the fact that obviously from here in the UK we look at restrictions and probably think of them as a thing of the past, hopefully, but that's not necessarily true elsewhere. There are still kind of mask mandates in place in different countries. There's still the prospect of perhaps more lockdowns. And equally, as we go through the year, maybe as we get towards winter, it's playing on people's mind that they don't know where we'll be. So I think there are reasons why people may still be uncertain there, but certainly the fact it was half struck us as being quite significant.
Okay, and perhaps fitting with that, I was struck by the fact that such a small proportion, only 2%, have booked or are planning a holiday in October, November. Well, November's normally a quiet year certainly for travel and for outbound travel, but October is the last month of the summer season, and often those without children take a holiday then. So that seems very low, just 2%. I wonder if that fits with the uncertainty, really, particularly in relation to the winter and whether COVID could return.
I think, yeah, you're probably right there. And also, we didn't show the data in here, but I say we tend to see that people are most likely saying they're going to book between 1 and 3 months in advance. So perhaps still reflecting a little bit of short-termism around, let's make sure that the kind of mood music is going in the right direction, rather than booking a trip far in advance that you end up being disappointed on, as you say, particularly with perhaps higher risk in winter. But also, I think that reflects the fact we were talking specifically there about main holidays, and I think it is that kind of summer sun that perhaps people have missed. We got lucky in, I think, 2020 with good weather through summer, perhaps a bit less so last year. So, this year people are wanting to ensure that situation.
Yeah, people in the outbound industry always pray for summer rain. So what conclusions should travel businesses, particularly outbound travel businesses, draw from what you've presented, Charlie?
I think the big conclusion, I guess, would be that, the appetite is there. There is probably reassurance needed for, as you say, quite a large group of people who are still not sure what they're doing. So, probably getting the news out there for them that travel is getting simple again. So some of the recent kind of scare stories around what's going on at airports won't have helped, perhaps getting on top of that messaging. I think actually we were talking about this in kind of preparation of this, and you were saying the numbers of flights actually being cancelled are tiny in real terms, but it sounds like it's an apocalypse at the airports at the moment. So that's probably something that needs to be got ahead of. That would be one conclusion. The other one is very much just that, yeah, people are excited about this. And I think, you know, getting in their faces and reminding them about the opportunities, you know, where they can go, what they can do. People are looking for that information. They enjoy seeing it. They enjoy being inspired to go places. So yeah, kind of, you know, tell them about destinations. I think that in some ways is probably the interesting opportunity. Are there new destinations now that have historically been less favoured by the UK public, but with things like different restrictions, etc., they might be perhaps a good kind of growth opportunity now.
And will you and Kantar be looking to develop this area of your research in the coming months, so we could see you back to present some further findings?
I would love to. If everybody who watches this webinar gets in touch with me, then I'll certainly have a very strong case for asking more and more questions on our TGI survey. But yeah, it's something we're going to be keeping an eye on very closely, because obviously it's something that gives us a kind of an interesting angle in terms of, I think it's obviously so top of mind for consumers. It's one of the first indicators of where they're at in terms of their outlook on life. So yeah, it's something we're going to be kind of covering in greater detail going forward. And
presumably your email address was on that last slide on the deck, was it?
That's a good question. I'm not sure it is, but charlie.gordon@Kantar can be found very easily.
Okay, Charlie, thank you so much for doing that. I hope we speak again soon.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure, Ian. Look forward to doing more of the same.